you all for your practice.
All right. So tonight we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics in this practice. Mindfulness of the mind. So I've been doing a series on the Satipatthana Sutta for, I'd say, the past month and a half or so. And I've been kind of teasing it out. So the first week I gave an overview of all of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And then we went over mindfulness of breathing. And from there we went to mindfulness of bodily postures, mindfulness of bodily activities. And then we went through the 32 parts of the body, the 4 elements, and the cemetery contemplations. And last week we went over mindfulness of feeling tone, or Vedana, as it's known in Pali. This week, as I said, we're going to be talking about mindfulness of the mind. And in Pali, the word is chitta, and chitta is actually translated into a few different things. It's often translated as mind. It's also translated as heart. It's translated as heart-mind. Stephen Batchelor has gone as far as to translate chitta as soul, which can be kind of useful, I think. So tonight I want to talk about exactly what chitta is, how it shapes our experience, and what the Buddha said about practicing mindfulness of the mind. So as I said, mindfulness of chitta is classically translated as mindfulness of mind, but in reality it's so much more than that. What it is it really contains our thoughts, our emotions, our mental attitudes. All of the 6 sense doors are brought in. In this case, it would actually be 5 sense doors, because the 6th sense door in Buddhism is the mind. And we tend to think of the mind specifically where thinking occurs. And while that's true, as I said, chitta encompasses so much more than that. And all of this is happening at the same time, and it kind of just culminates in what we call the mind. So it's this coalescence of all of our experiences. It's the coalescence of our senses, our emotions, our thoughts. And I don't know if you noticed, but the mind can be pretty chaotic. Anybody had that experience? Does anyone here feel like they think too much? One of the things that I hear from people the most about meditation is they're like, oh, I can't meditate. I think too much. It's like, well, yeah, that's the practice. That's what it is. It's like observing that. It's like, yeah, we're going to think. You can't stop the mind from thinking. As much as we would like to sometimes, you can't stop the mind from thinking. It's going to think. So they get pretty relieved when I told them that that's a fairly normal thing and that is the practice. We're not going to be able to stop our thoughts. So if you are one of those people, don't worry, because so is everybody else. You're not alone in that. And that's because, as I said during the meditation, the mind is just another autonomic process of the body. The eyes see on their own, the lungs breathe on their own, the mind thinks all by itself. It's like having thoughts without a thinker. And so the practice of mindfulness of mind is just letting all of these activities happen, letting our emotions happen, letting our thoughts occur, letting all of our senses light up the electrical impulses in the brain, and just observing that. And so basically what we're doing is we're observing the content and processes of the mind. So when I first started meditating and really got into this practice, a lot of you have heard this story, and I don't know who I'm really speaking to right now because people come and go. So you've probably heard this story before, and if you haven't, you'll hear it a million more times because it's one that I tell a lot. But I started meditating in jail. I was looking at a 25-year minimum mandatory sentence for something that I didn't do, but I was guilty of something. So there I sat in jail waiting for court, and I ended up getting a year in jail. And while I was in jail, this was before I was sentenced. I was, as I said, looking at a 25-year minimum mandatory sentence, which is no small amount of time. So as you can imagine, I was losing my whole mind, and my anxiety was at an all-time high. The only time I think I felt more anxious was when I was diagnosed with cancer. And so that says a lot. But I was, as I said, completely anxious, worried about the future. That was completely out of my control at that point. And what I did, I was bored one day and I was looking for a book to read, and I happened upon a book called We're All Doing Time. And funny title, because it's really true in a sense. And it was like, even though you're incarcerated, you can be free on the inside. And so it gave some basic like mindfulness of breathing practices and some yoga asanas. And it was like, treat this time while you're incarcerated like it's your monastery. So that seems like a pretty good idea. So that's what I did. And I started meditating. I started meditating every day, and at first it was only 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes grew to 10 minutes. And then by the time I got out of jail, I was able to sit for hours. And I don't know if any of you have ever watched any TV shows about jail, but it's a pretty loud and chaotic place. It's not exactly the most fertile pasture for meditation, but I feel like if you can meditate in jail, you can pretty much meditate on the top of a rocket ship. And it's interesting, I was actually listening to a Dharma talk one of my teachers gave not that long ago, just a few days ago, and he was talking about a Dharma teacher and a monastic named Ajahn Brahm. And Ajahn Brahm is an Englishman who is a Thai forest monk, but teaches in Australia. So he's, he gets around. And he teaches in prisons. And he was noticing the similarities, but yet differences between the monastery and the prison. In the monastery, you get 1 meal a day and you have to beg for it. In the jails, you get 3 meals a day. In the jail, you get a mattress. It's not a great mattress. It's a terrible mattress, and you're sleeping on a metal rack with a mattress about this thick, and it's not very comfortable at all. But in the monastery, you sleep on the floor. In the monastery, you get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. In jail, you can sleep as long as you want. So there's a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. But the biggest difference, Ajahn Brahm said, is that people want to be at the monastery. Nobody wants to be in jail. Nobody wants to be in prison. So while there are some differences, there are a lot of similarities. And so the point of that is it doesn't matter where you're at. It's all about the quality of the mind that determines your mental state, whether you're happy or you're suffering. And there's a Viktor Frankl quote from Man's Search for Meaning. And it said, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And so that's the opportunity that we have, to choose our own way. And that can go either way, right? Like, it doesn't matter what our circumstances are. We can have nothing or we can have everything, and we can still suffer. And the Buddha knew this from his own experiences. Because, Siddhartha Gautama, the man that was to become the Buddha, as the story goes, he grew up in luxury. It's said that he was a prince, but in 2,600 years ago in India, they didn't really have kings and princes so much. So it was likely that his family were just like the wealthiest landowners in that area. But he was born into a high caste, and he lived a very sheltered life. He was afforded all of the things that he could want. He had all the best food, he had all the best entertainment, he had all the sex he wanted. Anything he wanted was at his disposal. And what he found was that he was still suffering. He wasn't happy. And so he set out to figure that out. He left the monastery, or he left the palace, as it goes, and encountered what are known as the 3 heavenly messengers. And so he encountered a sick person, he encountered an aging person, and he saw a corpse. And he asked his attendant, he's like, is all that going to happen to me? And he's like, yeah, that happens to everybody. It's going to happen to you too. And so they kind of leave this out at some of the time, but he encountered a 4th person, and that was a mendicant, a monk, somebody pursuing the spiritual life. And he said, oh, maybe that's the key. Maybe I should take up the spiritual life. So he set out and left the palace and became an ascetic. And I don't know if you know anything about asceticism, but it's the complete opposite of the life that he was used to. It said that he was eating by the time he was done with his ascetic practice, he was eating roughly like 1 grain of rice per day, and performing some pretty austere things to the body, self-flagellation and such, and completely depriving himself of comfort. Because he thought that if comfort couldn't be, if he was still suffering with all the things that he wanted, then maybe the opposite end of the spectrum was the key to ending his suffering. And so, he tortured himself. And what he found was, well, surprise, surprise, still suffering. So you can have everything and you can have nothing and you'll still suffer. And so what he woke up to was this middle way, this middle path. But not without a little bit of trouble first, right? Because while he was sitting in meditation under the Bodhi tree, as the story goes, the demon Mara showed up. And Mara is like the Buddhist equivalent of the devil, right? So, and what Mara really is the personification of what are known as the 5 hindrances. And so when the Buddha was sitting in meditation, he noticed lustful thoughts in his mind. It said that Mara sent his daughters, and they took the form of sexy ladies trying to tempt the Buddha away. But what it really was his mind. His mind turned to lustful thoughts. But rather than giving them any attention, he simply observed them and he said, "I see you, Mara." Rather than trying to push them away, he just noticed them. And so when that didn't work, his mind went to hatred. Went to hating meditation, went to hating everything. And again, rather than try to push those thoughts away, he simply said, "I see you, Mara. I see you." And then what happened is his mind turned to doubt. Mara whispered to him, "Who do you think you are? Trying to awaken. This is futile. Meditation is going to get you absolutely nowhere. You will never awaken. And even if you did, there's no one here to witness it. No one will be your witness." And again, rather than pushing those thoughts away, he said, "I see you, Mara." And he put his right hand on the ground and said, "The ground will be my witness." And at that point, he awakened. And that's such a cool story, right? I love the idea of Mara. Because we all have Mara. Every one of us has Mara, because we all have a mind. And Mara shows up all the time, and a lot of time in the worst possible times. And this is one of the things that he's quoted as saying after his awakening. He said, "O house builder, you are seen. You will not build this house again, for your rafters are broken and your ridgepole shattered. My mind has reached the unconditioned. I have attained the destruction of craving." And what he did is he noticed that it was never his situation or his circumstances. It was always just his mind. And that's reflected in the first and second verses of the Dhammapada. And it says, "All dhammas," and dhammas meaning mental phenomenon, "are preceded by mind. They have mind as their chief. They are mind-made. If one speaks or acts with an evil mind, suffering follows him, just as the wheel follows the hoofprint of the ox that draws the cart. All dhammas have mind as their forerunner. They have mind as their chief. They are mind-made. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows him like a shadow that never departs." And so the message for this is, that pain is going to happen, right? It's like the old cliche, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. The world is full of pain. It's a painful place to be. But it's our minds that create the suffering, right? It's our minds that create the suffering. Because we can experience pain without suffering over it, with just the acknowledgement that life is difficult, right? We're all going to get sick. We're all going to die. Some of us will age. Some of us won't. Some of us will die before we get the chance to get old. So yeah, pain is unescapable, but the suffering is absolutely optional. And and it's not our fault. It's an easy trap to fall into. Suffering is an easy trap to fall into, because when we experience pain, the untrained mind will begin to experience what in Pali is known as papancha. And papancha is a Pali term that means a few different things. And Andrew Olinsky wrote in Lion's Roar, which is a Buddhist publication, he said the exact derivation of papancha is not entirely clear, but its sense hovers somewhere between the three nodes of to spread out or proliferate, an illusion or an obsession, or an obstacle or impediment. The place where these three meanings converge in experience is not hard to locate. Sit down and meditate, and what do you see? Papancha. And this term is used to describe the tendency of the mind to spread out from and elaborate upon any sense object that arises in experience, smothering it with wave after wave of mental elaboration, most of which is illusory, repetitive, and even obsessive, which effectively blocks any sort of mental calm or clarity of mind. So these are the narrative loops that play over and over in the mind, the trains of thought pulling out of the station one after another and taking us for a long ride down the track before we even know that we're aboard. Bhikkhu Bodhi calls papancha the propensity of the worldling's imagination to erupt in an effusion of mental commentary that obscures the bare data of cognition. So this is, in this practice, what we call that taking the second arrow, right? Mm-hmm. So we can experience the pain, but then all of the stories that we create around it, that's taking the second arrow. So it's like walking into a forest. The story is a man walks into a forest and he gets shot with one arrow, and that's the initial pain of the experience. And then the mental proliferation, the papancha, is that second arrow that we take. And this is what the Buddha referred to as the monkey mind, or kapicita. And he used this to describe the agitated, easily distracted, and incessantly moving behavior of ordinary human consciousness. So again, not our fault. Once he observed, and this is a quote from the Buddha, he said, "Just as a monkey swinging through the trees grabs one branch and lets it go, only to seize another, so too that which is called thought, mind, or consciousness arises and disappears continually, both day and night." And so the monkey mind has this quality of the hindrance of restlessness to it, right? It's this easily agitated quality of the mind. Never settled, always grasping. Do you experience that quality of mind? A mind that just gets lost in thought, likes to just create stories where there's no stories needed. And if you do, don't worry. As I said, that's just kind of what the mind does. And that's where mindfulness comes in, right? When we're practicing mindfulness of the mind, we're using the mind to observe the mind. That's all we're doing. Manindra, one of Joseph Goldstein's teachers, he was a teacher for Sharon Salzberg, Deepa Ma, a lot of other really well-known, prolific Dharma teachers, said that if you want to understand the mind, sit down and observe it. And so when we're practicing mindfulness of mind, what we're doing is we're observing the presence of unskillful qualities of the mind. So we're observing these hindrances. And so we're just becoming aware of them. Because oftentimes when we're experiencing these hindrances, and if you're not familiar with what these hindrances of mind are, they're craving, aversion, lethargy, restlessness, and doubt. And often when we're experiencing them, we're so caught up in them that we don't even notice that we're experiencing them. So once we're aware that we're wearing the lens of craving, we don't have to get lost in the pull of it. It gives us some agency over it. We're also looking for the absence of these qualities of the mind, which is something that I think is a little obscure for most of us, right? How often have you thought, I'm not feeling any aversion at all right now? Like, I feel perfectly fine. For me, that didn't come naturally, to look for the absence of these qualities. And we can notice when these qualities are occurring, but are we ever really mindful of when they're not occurring? Not unless we're paying attention. In the Satipatthana, the instructions for this practice are, and this is going to be a little long, and how does a monk remain focused on the mind in and of itself? There is the case where a monk, when the mind has passion, discerns that the mind has passion. When the mind is without passion, he discerns that the mind is without passion. And when the mind has aversion, he discerns that the mind has aversion. When the mind is without aversion, he discerns that the mind is without aversion. When the mind has delusion, he discerns that the mind has delusion. Anybody want to guess what the next part is? Yeah, you're right. When the mind is without aversion, he observes that the mind is without delusion. When the mind is constricted, he discerns that the mind is constricted. And it goes on and on like that. And in this way, he remains focused internally on the mind in and of itself, or externally on the mind in and of itself, or both internally and externally on the mind in and of itself. And there's another passage that's not really important to that, but you get the idea. We're observing the presence and absence of unskillful qualities of mind. And it's by observing the mind that we begin to understand the impersonal nature of the mind, right? Like I said before, it's like thoughts without a thinker. The mind just does what the mind does. We don't have to get wrapped up in the stories that the mind creates. We can identify a thought as just being a thought, rather than attaching any meanings to it or any narratives or stories. We can just say, oh, a thought. This word sati, it's translated as mindfulness, but what it really means is to remember. So we remember that a thought is a thought. It's nothing more than a thought. And the last time I checked, thoughts aren't reality. They can get pretty close sometimes, but they're not reality. And again, this is one of the most beneficial practices that we can really undertake, because the mind is where suffering is made. All suffering is mind made. Pain's for real. Pain's gonna happen. We're gonna lose things and people we love. We're not gonna get things that we want. We're gonna have to be around people we don't necessarily want to be around. We're gonna get old. We're gonna get sick, and we're all gonna die. And that's painful. But we don't have to suffer around that. Just the acknowledgement that, life is hard can just be enough, I think. It's kind of expected. Tara Brach has a book, Radical Acceptance. And that's kind of what this practice is. It's just the practice of radical acceptance. Because what is equanimity but radical acceptance? Just letting things be as they are. To be free of preference. Just be okay with whatever arises. So again, once you see a thought arise, just know a thought is a thought. Manindra had another quote that I really like, and it's, a thought of your mother is not your mother. And I love that quote. I think that's a really good quote. The mind, it's just the mind is the mind, and it's going to do what the mind does. Just by just slowing down and just remembering that you're in control. I know it doesn't seem like that a lot of the time, but you're absolutely in control of what this thing does. And we determine how much attention we give it. Just by slowing down, we get a little agency over the mind. Just by observing the mind with the mind. So let's do some practice around that.